Today's session has, I think, a couple of elements that I think will hopefully be relevant for your work. Obviously, a big part of it is related to disaster recovery and resilience, which is a huge issue in rural, mainly because most disaster systems have not been really designed for smaller places. And we haven't really moved from this idea of kind of a command and control, almost military-like, let's make sure everybody's safe, to then we want to make sure that no person benefits from a disaster. So we're going to take this very aggressive sort of insurance approach to make sure we're only building back what was there before. And so it's almost like a punitive construct that is kind of the model of how we've done disasters. So it hasn't really lent itself to a lot of good work and a lot of opportunities to do some systems change in our communities and regions. And so these folks today, and I will add some comments, are here to talk about that. I think where we'll start is I'll have you guys introduce yourselves briefly at the beginning, and then you can say more as you go. And Elizabeth, you're going to go first, then Chloe, then Stephanie. And then I will sort of close out with a couple comments from our report. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth. Just say who you are, where you're from, just so everybody.
Sounds great. Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Baxter. I work with the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission, and I am the manager of disaster recovery and economic development planning.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Smith. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at Vermont Emergency Management.
Good morning. My name is Chloe Schaefer. I'm the Chief Planner for the Cape Cod Commission, which is the regional planning agency for Barnstable County in Massachusetts.
All right, I guess I will go first. All right, so as I mentioned, I am the manager of disaster recovery and economic development planning for Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background as to who our agency is and how we kind of got into this disaster recovery and resiliency planning space, which is something not necessarily traditional in the way that we had provided services to our member organizations in the past. And so Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission, or what we like to call MVRPC, serves a 6+ county region in southwest Ohio, and we encompass counties that are urban, suburban, and rural. We are a voluntary member organization, making up 97 members across those 6+ counties. And when I say plus, you'll see that tiny, tiny little section that has about 3 or 4 different small communities within there. And so that's our plus, if you will. So 97 of those members within our boundaries, 61 of them are local units of government, 24 are other governmental organizations, things such as public transits, public libraries, park districts, those types of organizations, and then 12 of those entities are non-governmental entities, such as private utilities and those types of things. We provide planning and research to our member organizations to ensure communities in our region remain livable and equitable. And about 80% of our funding comes through transportation planning dollars. However, we also provide some land use planning and equity planning services, but the primary foundation and core of our mission was founded on collaboration and convening, which you will see in the majority of the services that we provide and still continue on today. And so that's kind of the conversation I'm going to lean in today, is that convening and collaboration, with our resiliency and disaster recovery. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about the actual event that occurred to bring us into this disaster recovery and led us into resiliency planning. So with the event that we had was a little bit different than some of the natural disasters that face Southern Vermont. But I think the conversation that we can take away from this is the idea of collaboration and convening and how we can work together as a regional unit. So on May 27th of 2019, around 11 p.m. at night, 19 tornadoes ripped through our region, damaging about 6,000 properties across 3 of our member counties, with about 12,000 of those properties sustaining major damage or being completely destroyed. The total tornado path was approximately, about 20 miles, and at one point, the storm was about 900 yards wide, with an EF tornado being the largest of the storms, sustaining winds of over 170 miles per hour. And the majority of those tornadoes that hit our region, the pathway was through our disproportionately impacted and densely populated low-income neighborhoods, with the majority of those residents being either underinsured or uninsured. And so this map you can see up here showcases that pathway, and those red dots are those completely damaged or destroyed properties, with the majority of those being from Trotwood to northern Dayton. And those areas that were mostly impacted, it wiped out a lot of our affordable housing and multifamily housing within those communities as well. And so the days following that disaster, it became very clear to our impacted jurisdictions that they were going to need additional support with recovery services. And so they found themselves very unsure of how to navigate that recovery process, and then also competing for local recovery resources, because in our area, Dayton, Ohio, or Miami Valley region is about a mid-sized community. And so we pull a lot of the same resources for a lot of these communities as well to help provide that recovery. And then the other important point to note about this specific storm was the State of Ohio Emergency Management Agency that typically helps respond to our local disasters and helps our communities with the recovery efforts. This specific storm was actually a statewide storm, and so it caused a lot of flooding and other damage across a number of communities within the state. And so the Ohio EMA was very thinly stretched, and so they had a little bit of difficulty as well providing that response and resource that they traditionally would have provided. And so this is where MVRPC stepped in. Our members actually came to us and said, "We need help. We cannot do this alone. You guys are our natural regional entity, and you have been founded on convening. Can you help us navigate this system?" And so the first thing we did was we actually brought our impacted jurisdictions together to have that conversation and understand what resources that they needed and how they needed help in recovery. And so as you can imagine, because everybody was competing for a lot of those local resources, there was a lot of miscommunication going on, and the communication that was happening was not great. So that's where we were able to step in and help kind of facilitate those conversations. And so as we began to evaluate and understand the needs within our communities, can you go back one? Thanks. We were very clear that this recovery effort was going to take a whole community approach. It was not just the government or a governmental activity which was going to facilitate recovery. And so MVRPC teamed up with the organization that was leading our individual recovery to help establish a larger long-term recovery network. And so you can see on this screen how it was organized. MVRPC led the long-term community recovery, and so we worked with those local units of government. And then there was the long-term individual recovery, which helped support the actual individuals needing assistance with repair, financial assistance, those types of groups going through case management. And then there was also a larger, well, it was made of about 16 to 20 people, depending on, where we were at in the stages of our recovery. But it was a higher level advisory group that helped provide that oversight and transparency as we were working through recovery. And what we did to establish this network was we teamed up with FEMA to kind of help flush this out. Who does what agencies work with what, and who provides the types of services. And we used the National Disaster Recovery Framework as that foundation and those recovery support functions to help, really shape what this is comprised of. And we actually are still continuing this model throughout our resiliency planning and have shared this with a lot of our neighboring communities who have been impacted by disasters within the last, year to few months. All right, and so I think you can advance to the next slide now. Thank you. And so I mentioned about how we worked with our communities to establish that network, being the natural convener. The other things that we were able to do was provide another set of sub-tools with our access to mapping to track the recovery. We were able to also provide technical assistance and support with the federal funding that was flowing through. And then we were able to also just help understand the ability of what resources were coming through. So we acted as that liaison between the state agencies and federal agencies providing those resources. And at one point we had about $43 million in federal funding flowing into our region for recovery. And that was something either MVRPC helped manage, or it was something that we provided technical assistance on to helping our communities understand what projects are eligible and help identify the projects that would be eligible as well. And this map right here that I guess it's more of a dashboard is what we call it. That was one of the mapping tools that we utilized. Our GIS team actually helped develop this when our communities were working on the disaster assessment portion of our recovery efforts. They helped catalog, identify the type of dwelling that was damaged. They help understand the impact of the level of damage, and then plotted it out on a map. And that really helped us fast track that recovery effort. And, I think it was about 3 years post our disaster because of this tool right here and the network that we helped convene and establish. We were at over 80% of property recovery. And then coming up on our 5-year anniversary, which will be just next week, we are sitting at over 97% of property recovery rates. And you can advance to the next one. And so this is just another example of where we are now. You can see the pathway. Most of our communities consider themselves fully recovered, with the majority of their properties recovered. And then I think we can advance to the next slide. And so what we are doing is we are taking this effort not only from the disaster recovery framework and the timeline that we had, and we are taking it to our next steps, where we are incorporating resiliency into our communities. And so one thing that we heard loud and clear was that our communities didn't want that network to dissolve, but they did not see it as the way it was coordinated in that effort to continue to respond to natural disaster. And so we are working with groups that comprise of that network, which was really everybody: nonprofits, governmental leaders, EMAs, economic development organizations, private foundations, anybody and everybody, to continue to work and figure out what challenges we need to do when responding to a disaster and where those groups can help support. And so this is just another example. We've been meeting with different sectors of our community to help organize that effort, housing being the main concern that we still face today and planning for that. And so that is something that this group is continuing to do in the future. And we're also working with our communities to incorporate resiliency into everything that they do on a long-term basis. And so because we have access to many different plans already, we can help them understand where those resiliency aspects could fit into their communities and daily lives. So we can go forward. And then the final thing that I'd like to just point out, as they're telling me I need to wrap up my time, I guess I'm a long talker as well. We are incorporating the work that we do into our traditional planning efforts. And so MVRPC is incorporating resiliency aspects into our long-range transportation plans. We're also working with our state DOT to figure out where projects fit into their resiliency improvement plan. We have incorporated resiliency into our SEDS, or our Dayton Region Development Strategy. And then we have also started working on a climate pollution reduction grant that is sponsored through the US EPA, and making the connection between promoting resiliency practices and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, I will take any questions or maybe leave them to the end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to move from a larger region sort of outside of New England to a community you might be more familiar with, and with Chloe.
I'm going to see if I stand over here, if this might work. Not to seem like I need to be in control, but all right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chloe Schaefer. As I said earlier, I'm the Chief Planner for the Cape Cod Commission. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the resources we've developed for local implementation of some of our regional planning efforts, particularly around climate change. But first, just to start, maybe this won't work. Okay. There we go. Just very quickly, Cape Cod, we're a peninsula. We're about 60 miles southeast of Boston, out in the Atlantic Ocean. If you want to go next. Yeah, sorry. Just going to throw a wrench in everything here. But just to give you a tiny bit of context, we have a year-round population of about 230,000 people. This is spread across 15 different towns, though, who range in population from just a couple thousand to around 49,000 people. We are generally an older population. We are a big destination for retirees. Here you can see we're about 15 years older than the state and the country. So certainly that's reflected in our demographics. And then in terms of kind of the place itself, we are largely detached single-family homes, 80% of our current housing stock. So not a lot of variety in terms of our housing options, which is kind of compounding another challenge we're facing right now in terms of housing affordability. But we have over 500 miles of coastline, which is both a tremendous asset to the region, really part of what brings people to the Cape, but also in and of itself a vulnerability with climate change, sea level rise, and storm surges. Again, very seasonal. Over a third of our housing stock is used seasonally. And much of our land is either already developed or protected. So in terms of thinking about the future, thinking how we're going to accommodate development, it's really going to be particularly redevelopment. We need to be very thoughtful and deliberate, not a lot of room, if any, to expand. And then our economy, as I mentioned, highly seasonal, over 5 million visitors a year. You can see that peak in jobs in the summer months regionally. In some towns, it's much more than a third. And much of our top industries are related to our retiree and tourism trades, retiree population and tourism. So the Cape Cod Commission, as I mentioned earlier, we are the regional planning and regulatory agency for Barnstable County. And put very simply, our mission is keeping a special place special and really working to balance our environmental protection with economic progress. And the core of how we do this is through our regional planning initiatives. We regularly update and produce a regional policy plan. This really provides the overarching framework for our regional planning initiatives, includes a vision and growth policy for the region for the future, as well as diving into specific issue areas and providing goals and objectives there. And that really provides the touchstone for our other regional planning work as well as our regulatory work. But it can't do it all. One plan, unfortunately, cannot do it all. So we do have several topic-specific planning initiatives, including our own comprehensive economic development strategy, which we are also in the midst of updating, but a transportation plan. Our 208 plan deals with our coastal water quality challenges. We just completed a regional housing strategy and are in the midst of our freshwater initiative. But our climate action plan is what we completed in 2021, and I will touch on that briefly. So just at a very high level, some of the impacts we're already facing and plan to face for our region in terms of climate change. Certainly the oceans, as they're warming, impacts on our marine life, but also really impact some of our industries, including the fishing industry. But perhaps most tangibly for many of us is sea level rise, flooding, and erosion. And the impacts we're already feeling from that, which will only become more acute in the future. In terms of kind of laying the groundwork for our climate action plan, we worked with a consultant to understand what would happen if we don't take action, if we don't implement any interventions to change the course of kind of where we're going. And so we came up with this cost of doing nothing, looking really here at the built environment, what would be some of the damages incurred, and by the end of the century, it's estimated to exceed $50 billion to the region. So certainly all this pointing to the need for a regional climate action plan. Again, completed this in 2021. It was through, in the midst of COVID, but conducted a lot of baseline research and data gathering as well as stakeholder engagement to identify some priority strategies for the region. That stuff on the right, but some of the outputs really resources for implementation, which we know that while we're planning at a regional level and looking across town boundaries, implementation of many of these actions are really going to fall on the shoulders of our municipalities. So looking at how we can help them advance regional climate goals. One of the resources we came up with is this Municipal Climate Action Toolkit. So it contains 15 different action strategies for each of those, information on kind of an overview of the strategy, what it entails. If possible, there's a cost-benefit analysis to help people understand what those might be, what the state of practice is, what other communities are doing, case studies on it as well. And it can be, they're available online and can be kind of sorted by key outputs to really help communities hone in pretty quickly on what strategies might meet some of their priorities, if they're prioritizing greenhouse gas reductions, or if it's really what could they implement, fastest, just helping to provide a quick snapshot there of which ones they might turn to first. Can also be looked at in terms of the benefits as well as the costs and weighing those. And those are all available on our website, including a little README primer of what they contain and what they could be used for. But just one example of kind of really providing that first step of perhaps educating town staff, town officials, as well as the public in terms of looking at what they might be trying to implement first in terms of making a change in the climate sphere. Another project that we just wrapped up is our low-lying roads project. This has been going on for a few years and started with a handful of towns. It was funded by EDA, as well as we received some state funding down the line for it too. But it contains kind of these 4 key components of vulnerability assessment of the roadway network, working with the towns to prioritize roadway segments in terms of their vulnerability and risk. Then for those prioritized segments, developing some conceptual designs for how they might be adapted to be more resilient to potential impacts in the future, and all of this contained in online mapping applications. So we're fortunate to be able to utilize this statewide coast flood risk model, and this provides kind of the likelihood, you can see there, of future flooding across different time periods, 2030, 2050, 2070. And this is an extremely gross oversimplification of what went into this, but certainly looking at sea level rise, storms, as well as the topography and landscape in the area to really then be able to understand probability of floods as well as depth of floods that might occur. So this is the town of Falmouth, part of it, just one example. So what we did here, this is showing the probability of inundation using that model of these roadways in 2070 to understand which ones are likely to be flooded. We then developed, working with our consultants as well, a criticality score, looking at different roadway segments, the volume of traffic on them, the connections they're providing either to other centers of activity or to critical facilities to identify which are more critical in that sense, with the yellow ones being higher. And we combined those two things to come up with a risk factor, a risk score for the roadways. And these were used to help towns and stakeholders identify what 2 or 3 priority road segments for their towns where they wanted to have conceptual designs developed. So regionally, about 89 designs were developed across all the towns. They include gray infrastructure, some hybrid, some green infrastructure ideas as well, depending on what would be most appropriate and applicable. And all of that is available as well on our website, including a regional mapping application, which I think is really important because it allows towns to more easily see which roadways might be a priority and might be really at risk for them and are also right for their neighboring towns, so they can more easily identify projects to collaborate on and address across town boundaries. Another one we just finished up late last year are our flood area design guidelines. So certainly, as we're looking at adapting our coastline and adapting buildings in the floodplain, really how can we also maintain the Cape Cod vernacular style, which is really critical not only for our cultural heritage and history, but certainly is something that also brings people to the region and is key to our economy. And so those contain really a range of different adaptation strategies for buildings. They include things like retrofit and relocation. Much of the document is spent on elevating buildings and kind of key principles for what to keep in mind there in terms of maintaining the built fabric, and also including different neighborhood and site solutions and examples there. Just one example here, looking at elevating buildings, for example, elevating to consistent heights throughout a neighborhood. And then for neighborhood and site solutions, kind of taking an approach to see if you're going beyond just a specific building, what might be some of the other things that you might implement there. And those include some illustrative examples or case studies of what strategies might be more appropriate given the context of the neighborhood and the site. Is it a lower density area or is it higher density, something in between? Again, also all available on our website. And then last but certainly not least, we develop model bylaws and regulations for our local implementation, not only related to climate change, but to numerous other challenges we're facing. But just a few I'm going to touch on here. We're working on our coastal resiliency model bylaw and regulations, as well as a floodplain model zoning bylaw. These bylaws and regulations really are meant to help align the regulations of conservation commissions and planning boards. The coastal resiliency ones being focused on wetlands regulations, and really both sets of these providing protection of the built environment as well as natural resources, but with slightly different emphasis. So that coastal resiliency one providing more of an emphasis on natural resource protection, ensuring there's an allowance for migration of potential wetlands in the future, that type of a thing, whereas the floodplain one more focused on structures. What I think is important to note about both of these sets of regulations, though, is they allow towns to tie them to not just a current floodplain, but a projected floodplain. So the model being currently that Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Management one, for example, towns could say, okay, we actually want to regulate to the 2050 projection here. So putting in place those regulations now for impacts we might be seeing in the future, which if any of you have dealt with zoning, you know that change happens very slowly. So really critical to put those regulations in place now. And then I think I'm probably getting to time, but just really quickly, also developed a model large-scale solar bylaw to help our communities in allowing larger-scale solar developments, but given appropriate context and appropriate guidelines to also help with resource protection, kind of that community character protection as well. So thank you very much. All of this, again, on our website, but please feel free to reach out as well.
I also appreciate control and standing, so I'll come over here.
All right.
Because I can't see all of you when I'm sitting over there. So hi everyone, Stephanie Smith. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at Vermont Emergency Management. So I manage our hazard mitigation program for the state. I like to start with this slide. I talk to a lot of small towns that say hazard mitigation. What? They don't know what that means. It's a clunky FEMA term. Really what we're talking about is climate adaptation. How are we improving resilience in our communities? How are we reducing our future risks so that the next time we get 11 inches of rain, it doesn't flood as bad as it did the last time? So all of this is incremental progress type of things, but there's not one fix, but what are the things that we can do that completely eliminate risk for an area or lower flood elevations for our communities? So quickly from a high level, our program includes planning and grants. I'm mostly going to talk about the planning side today, but I have a slide at the end to give you a quick highlight on the grants. There's a lot to unpack there that I'm happy to chat about with anyone afterwards. But on the planning side, we have a state hazard mitigation plan that we update every 5 years. That document addresses all of the natural hazards that the state is vulnerable to, and it proposes a strategy through a large stakeholder process of state government and other entities for how we can reduce our future risk. So that plan gets into drought, it talks about landslides, it talks through all of the hazards. Flooding is the biggest section by far, that's the focus, and that's what I'm gonna focus on here today, but the state plan does cover that breadth of hazards. And local hazard mitigation plans. So in Vermont, we have municipal government, so we're required to do local hazard mitigation plans at the municipal level. Most of the country has counties and they do planning that way. We have 281 local municipal plans potentially if they all had a plan. So it's a lot. It's required for accessing any of the funding that I can speak to at the end. Again, required to address all of those hazards that community might be vulnerable to. And quick level set, so the hazard mitigation term level set, now this is your quick hydraulic lesson. I know some of you know this very well, but when we talk about planning for reducing flood risk in Vermont, it's important to understand that there's more than one type of flooding. Who's heard of the special flood hazard area? Okay, a lot of you, not everyone. Okay, so when FEMA has communities regulations are required at the municipal level for the special flood hazard area, which is FEMA's mapping of inundation flooding. So this is water that comes up. This is Waterbury during Irene. Water comes up, spills out onto its floodplain. That's one type of flooding. That's what we regulate to with FEMA. But there's another type of flooding that's actually, this is ranked as our highest hazard within our state hazard mitigation plan, which is fluvial erosion. So part of what I was asked to speak to today is, since Tropical Storm Irene to July, what's changed? How has our perspective changed? It's important to understand this distinction to get that point. So in Vermont, we have incredibly dynamic rivers. They're coming down mountains, they're making curves, they're turning, they're moving around things. So this picture on the bottom right shows the natural change of a river, how a river would, if it didn't have our infrastructure in its way, how would it move over time? And so the top on the other side is that meander belt, so the space that the river wants to move within, which speaks to a really different type of flooding than that inundation risk. So this is what erosion looks like. This is what we saw during Tropical Storm Irene, very heavily across the state. It's cutting out banks. It's a home that doesn't have flood insurance because it's not in the special flood hazard area, and it's high, so it's not in that inundation zone. But then Irene happens, and it's a one-time failure event. So one of our biggest challenges within my program is convincing FEMA to help us pay for these types of projects when that's not how they see flooding. So Tropical Storm Irene, as I said, a lot of the photos, they look like this. It's foundations that have been undercut. It's not just water coming up, it's water that's moving, it's dynamic, it's cutting out infrastructure. And one of the big pushes through our state hazard mitigation plan following Irene and this better understanding this dynamic river model, this inundation risk, was to create a new program that allows us to fund the things that FEMA can't because it addresses that erosion-based risk. So there was a lot of learning following Tropical Storm Irene in how we plan for flooding around that erosion area, how we do the projects that we need to do to reduce risk. And that's where this program came in as one of our top priorities in our state plan that we were able to push for when ARPA funding was available. And so what did we do directly after Irene? I just have two quick project examples just to highlight for you the types of things that happened. So this is an example in Northfield, which was hit very heavily during Irene, of really leaning in on property buyouts. We do a lot of buyouts in the state. There's a lot of angst around losing housing stock and the challenges that surround that right now. This is a community that, following a significant event, really leaned in and said, we're going to support these property owners, we're going to do these buyouts. And this is actually, on the bottom, it's in the floodway, which is an even higher risk area from FEMA's determination. It's the area where the river wants to be, not just where it needs to access during a flood. So they were able, out of this process, to remove these blighted properties that had flooded significantly, remove a bunch of fill that had been added over time, create this beautiful community asset, this park. You should stop by next time you're in Northfield. That most of the time is not underwater, but when the river needs to access it, it can come up, it can access this space. It also provides access to the river, so people can go to this park, walk on these trails, access the river, and it lowered flood elevations in the surrounding neighborhood. So trying to maintain the housing that we can, recognizing that this is an area where it's not safe. People should not be living in houses right here. And another quick example, this is one of the best things we did with our FEMA funding following Irene, which is in Brandon. So Brandon was hit very heavily during Irene. The Neshobe River, which comes on the top there, you can see it comes around. It usually goes around the downtown. It went straight through downtown, decimated Brandon. And we were able to put in a couple $1 million project here, but a very large overflow culvert that most of the time is completely empty. It looks like this. And when the river needs to access it, when the river is high, it can go under the community now instead of over it. So it's been accessed many times. It's been an incredibly successful project. And those are the sort of things that now we're looking at with this funding following July. How do we find these similar projects in our towns, help protect these communities where they are, and keep our communities in place? There we go. And then July happened. So Irene was really an eye-opener in terms of that erosion flood risk. July was a little bit of both. So this is Montpelier, inundated with water. We saw a lot of communities that looked like this, but we also saw a good amount of erosion. It was both of these types of floodings, very, very prevalent in July. And pretty extreme forms of erosion. It's a landslide. There's a river at the bottom, but we saw unprecedented landslide failure in July as well, and directly following that event. And then other landslides that weren't even near water. So this is in Ripton. This is one of the property buyouts that we're going to be doing very soon. It's in FEMA review to purchase this property that was destroyed by this landslide. So it was another learning moment of, now we still have this inundation risk, we still have this erosion risk, but when you get that much water, your slopes are not going to be stable, and we saw significant landslide risk as well. Okay, so where are we now in terms of funding? So the The big funding that I'll talk about here, and I just have the one slide, but I would love to talk more about it with anyone who wants to know more, is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. So that's our large FEMA pot of funding that follows disasters in the state. So whenever we have a disaster, that's a federally declared disaster with public assistance funding. Public assistance is the program that puts things back that broke in very high level terms. We get a pot of this money. So we've had a pot open every single year since Tropical Storm Irene. Some of those have been very small, like $600,000. Irene was 34 million. Now we're looking at 90 million following July. So it's by far the most funding we've ever had to do this work. We're working with our communities to try and develop those bigger projects like that Brandon Culvert. How do we get in that multi-million-dollar project to do that thing that's going to make a difference within our towns? So really that's the place we're in right now and trying to focus how we get that funding out into our communities. And I'll stop there. Didn't even run out of time.
All right, great job. We adapted to the no clicker, and I got to test my button pressing skills. So I'm just going to give you a couple of slides from a report that we did about a year and a half ago, which is really centering this idea of natural disaster and why it's so important in rural and what needs to change. You've heard three, I think, great examples of both a large region with a traumatic sort of singular event of tornadoes which have sort of immediate damage. I think the Cape Cod example of really planning for climate change and that natural disaster can be both slow and not as predictable. And I really want to laud that work because it's a lot of foresight to do that. A lot of places, when I left North Carolina to come to DC, North Carolina had just changed parties which took over the legislature, and they actually passed a law that said no one is allowed to use any data that anticipates sea level rise in any planning because they were as a defiance of climate change. So you can imagine how, it's almost the opposite of what you all did, and there's a price to pay for that, and particularly in a state where the beaches are all barrier islands. And unfortunately, they developed those barrier islands with a lot of second homes, and nobody wanted to face the fact that maybe those weren't going to be sustainable. And so they made the problem worse. And then I think the Vermont example, again, of this idea of there is the traumatic event of flooding, but all the erosion and planning of that, again, is not part of what we always think of is because the events and the scope of those events are increasing. I happen to have lived through the flood of 1984 when the Connecticut River was at a 500-year floodplain, and the school that I went to, I was working on the grounds crew, unfortunately, that summer after my freshman year in college, and was able to ride a canoe all the way around the entire school because there was 6 feet of water in a place that had never had water before. So, and that was, a while ago. So I'm going to share a couple things that we've had. Again, I wanted to highlight, there are national conversations recognizing, separate from just the whole pieces of climate change, that we are having more natural disasters. And for the last decade, the government has spent more on housing through FEMA than it has through HUD and USDA combined. We spend more and more, and because disasters are sort of off budget, it's created this interesting coalition of folks, of more conservative small government folks who want to see less government spending, and environmental folks who are like, we need to stop building in the floodplain. And unfortunately, it hasn't gone anywhere for the same reason I mentioned the North Carolina example, because it involves having to move people and anticipate that folks living in the floodplain is not a sustainable strategy. Some of it is, raising houses, as you described in on the Cape Cod example. But I'll give you an example. In the South, every floodplain contains an African American community that was created after the Civil War. That's where people could live. And those are deep historical places, and it is an emotional equity decision to talk about that, and that's created a kind of intractability in this work, but it is difficult and it's only getting worse. And so this is a national issue, and I think how do we move from this kind of insurance, build it back to this idea of this is a community development opportunity. We should be addressing what are the structural things, both from a resilience, but also a investment opportunity. How would we take this recovery opportunity and actually build and invest in some stuff that's been missing? And we haven't done that, but I think there's a lot of political will to do that, and I think that is the next great opportunity. A lot of health issues anytime there's water. Huge amount of issues related to mold, and unfortunately, a lot of our recovery efforts in the United States are driven by volunteer, particularly faith-based organizations. I had never realized this until I got into this space, that every major denomination, including the Scientologists, who have one of the largest displays in FEMA every year when they have everybody get together. This has become a major piece of their work, which is great, and I'm no way impugning that, but recovery from flood and water and dealing with mold is a technical skill set. It is not something that volunteers, even well-meaning volunteers, are always equipped, and particularly with low-income folks, if those homes are rebuilt and there's mold inside, they're often trapped in an asset they can't sell, they can't get insurance for, and they can't pay for recovery. So it has almost an oppressive element. And I think we have to rethink, how are we going to make sure that these most vulnerable populations are treated really well and get the kind of rebuilding they need, and not just say, we're going to, give people food and they're all going to sleep in tents and we're going to rebuild this. That's great, but if there are problems, it's really tough to recover. And so the health issues have become worse. In some of these places like Kentucky, the flooding is different than, say, it is in Vermont, New England, New Hampshire, because of mining. And so they're flooding because all their streams are full of silt. And so the solutions are different. And so the underlying conditions are unique in each place. Each of the New England states and regions have different conditions, and we need to have the flexibility in our recovery to adapt to that, rather than the rigidity of this is what we do and we apply it equally to each community. Everything we do when we do convenings includes Native, Tribal, Indigenous voices. We usually represent within the convening, each of the reports I talked about is usually about 30 folks from around the country, and about half of those are people working of communities of color. But a lot of the lessons that we go back to really have a lot of centering in traditional indigenous practices of how to maintain and manage natural resources. And I think there's a lot to learn about how people particularly we've learned it more in the fire space, about we moved from understanding how regular burns actually prevent massive forest fires to like a policy that the goal was to prevent any fire ever, which actually created much worse fires later, for example. The notion that I talked about using this as an opportunity to advance regional prosperity, and again, the idea that we have to think about how do we build our capacity to address natural disasters. You've had 3 examples, particularly in the Dayton and Cape Cod, of a lot of capacity investment showing its benefit for both the planning and response, and not every place has that. And we need to be able to help our regions do that kind of planning, do that kind of regional coalition building, and instead of just, we've had something terrible happen, now we've got to scramble and build this infrastructure that hasn't existed before. And then finally, this flexibility that comes from philanthropy's involvement. Traditionally, philanthropy is often asked to step in a kind of crisis response way, but this notion of government's not the best always at that ability to fund this kind of regional work or that capacity building work, whereas philanthropy can really be that key partner. And so we're really pushing both national and regional philanthropy to do more in that space. So with that, I am going to stop and we are going to take questions. Absolutely. Scott. And
Quick question. This is sort of a combination for the Vermont folks and also the MVRPC. So back in a previous life, I lived in Germantown as a village manager, so I'm well aware of MVRPC. One of the great success stories, and I know you didn't get a chance to talk about everything, was there was horrible flooding in the early part of the century in the Dayton area, and they created this thing around dams and a large-scale flood control process that works and still works to this day. And I was wondering if that model could somehow be applied to what's happening here in Vermont. Because while these individual community solutions are great, without these regional sort of solutions, we're all going to suffer the same, repeating over and over and over. And then maybe you could talk about how that conservancy district then also helps pay for that maintenance over time, because the model works, and it's worked there now for over 100 years.
Yeah, you're right. So the Miami Conservancy District is what he is referencing, and that I believe they do 13 plus counties. They administer protections against the buried aquifer that provides drinking water to those counties within our area, as well as they oversee that flood protection for those communities in that watershed. So I would recommend reaching out to the Miami Conservancy District for some of the models and techniques that they use. But that Great Flood of 1913 was something that severely impacted the region, and was the engineering and infrastructure that was built surrounding that to protect it over 100 years ago is still very, very much used today. We use something a little bit similar to what you were talking about with overflow. We have a lot of farm fields in that area that allows for overflow when our waters start to rise. And they do utilize some very interesting techniques to continue those protections today. And currently they're going through an assessment to continue the ability to pay for some of that work, as well as maintenance and maintain those. So I can't speak to that directly, but Miami Conservancy District is one of MVRPC's member organizations, and we work very closely with them in a lot of capacities surrounding our environmental planning. They are great resources, and they are very, very much a key and primary resource within our region to help protect us from flooding and disasters like the 1913 flood, as well as some of the flooding that you guys unfortunately have been faced with here within the last few years. Is that helpful?
Hey, I'm Chris Campion. I'm Executive Director of the Windham Regional Commission here in Southeast Vermont, and I chair the Emergency Planning Committee among the state's 11 regional planning commissions, and also the Natural Resources Committee of that same group, so it's a nice melding. And I just want to acknowledge, I keep seeing, and it's just growing, women really are the leaders in the emergency planning realm these days and hazard mitigation realm, so awesome. Glad to see it's among our staff too, it's the case. So Chris, I want to take advantage of your kind of national perspective on something. I'm glad you brought up like the differences in the South earlier. You're talking about like the governmental structure and the power of individual families, and contrasting that to some extent with what the structure in New England, and then also like the climate denialism as a matter of policy. But my concern for not just Vermont but New England is you're talking about interconnectedness and recognizing interconnectedness and interdependence, and then also avoiding or breaking down stovepipes. But since the 1600s, New England has designed these stovepipes to where we have 281 stovepipes that are expected to make decisions around adaptation and resilience in Vermont. That's repeated throughout New England. I think it's even perhaps more challenging in northern New England just because of the resource issues. So doing it at the scale and at the watershed scales and at the community scale where it's needed is really challenging. And then, like in the absence of any county government where you can aggregate public dollars to at a county scale and an intermunicipal scale, it's almost impossible to do things between the municipal level and state level. So a lot doesn't get done. And I've been participating in a lot of discussions around climate migration, like how do you accommodate the people who are already here and make room for people who are coming. And to my mind, that also means people retreating, probably like take an ex-urban development form, retreating in from the coast of Massachusetts and, the New England coast, as people can afford to do it. And to my mind, our biggest barrier to climate adaptation and resilience are structural ones. Not being able to actually do the decision-making that's needed and make the investments that are needed, because we're still relying on each of these tiny geographies. And you're talking about stovepiping and like interconnectedness, even within our own towns, right? It's like, I'll pick on Westminster, which I dearly love. There's Westminster and there's Westminster West, and it's like, trying to get the two to talk. I used to live in Newfane, love Newfane to death, but there is Newfane Village quadrant and there's South and West Newfane, trying to get them to talk. And it's like, you may as well be in different planets. And then like our Route 30 West River corridor, towns not talking to each other, not coordinating with each other. And then when you get to the regional commission level, and this is a New England issue too, and I bet it somewhat exists in Ohio, our funding is stovepiped. So we do what the legislature tells, we're 95% grant funded. And so we do what the legislature lets us do every given year, like the actual ability to say, we're going to go out and have broad community conversations. We're not funded to do that. So from your perspective, I'm not trying to go on and on about this, but just for the New England folk, it is different out in other parts of the world. What do you see about New England? I'm desperate to find a public administration program to kind of help us tell the story of ourselves. And
Thanks for that. A couple of thoughts. One, I think the intersection opportunity we have to blend these conversations with people who might be more fixated on economic development, let's say, is in the intersection of the outdoor recreation space. Because so much of New England economic growth and planning is thinking about outdoor rec as a strategy, but it's obviously immediately connected to the natural resources and the sustainability of those resources. So getting folks in the room who can think about these conversations of mitigation and planning and sustainability with the folks who are thinking about tourism and sort of business development and an entrepreneurial ecosystem is, I think, one opportunity to bridge that discussion. It also lends itself to bigger than just governmental structures, because outdoor amenities are not all camped by our governmental boundary lines, even our state boundary lines. And that's, I think, the benefit of the Northern Border Commission in particular, brings regional around this sort of region of naturalness, I guess is the way I would describe it, versus the state boundaries which divide us. The second thing I would say, this is where regional leadership discussions really matter. And so any opportunity where you can, not just the traditional leaders, the elected officials, but people who are leaders in their community being able to participate in regional leadership development efforts and conversations to build trust and awareness really matter, and give us an opportunity to cut across that. New England is almost like a hyper-democracy in a way, in the sense of its representation and its smallness and its divisions, particularly when you go, like just 3 weeks ago, I was in eastern Washington State with a conference with Eastern Oregon and Idaho and Northern California, and their counties are often as large as your state, for example. So, but their regionalism still really matters, and it's still hard. But it does take an intentionality, and I think the kind of planning you've seen here, both having a disaster event may be the catalyst, but also the planning and sustainability of your economic engine might be the other element to push people out of their comfort zones. And it's only going to get more important for all of our work in this region to be able to cut across the, northern versus southern Vermont, Vermont versus New Hampshire, northern Maine versus southern Maine, southern Maine versus northern Vermont, New Hampshire. Like, we all have ways it's easy to divide ourselves, but the commonality of what we have at stake is really important. The last thing I would add is that on that migration, West Virginia's entire economic development model coming out of the University of West Virginia is all based on an attraction strategy of people fleeing the Gulf region. And it is based on an idea of we're going to have broadband everywhere, and we're going to market the heck out of all of our natural outdoor amenity, outdoor rec things, and say you can live within how far all these different opportunities are, which is, I think, I'm not criticizing it as a bad idea, but it does demonstrate they may not be ready to talk about climate change, but they are adapting to planning for it. My criticism to them was, what about the people you've already got? And that's another danger of the attraction tourism focus, is that, and that's why I keep talking about public health. Like, public health says, what are the problems we have in our community and how do we fix them? Economic development says, what are the assets we have and how do we get people to move here and bring us more stuff or more opportunity? And we have to blend a little bit of that. How do we build things and respond to our local challenges while we're also trying to get what's missing? So sorry to go on too long. I'll take it up.
Relay.
This is being recorded, so that's why we're trying to make sure everybody's on the mic.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about wastewater and the constraints that come up. Yeah, I see the eyebrows rising, yeah. I'm aware that with more moisture, the water table's rising, septic fields are failing more often, and in some of these floods, towns are losing their treatment plants. So when we look forward, how do we anticipate how those constraints and capacities are going to affect future events? How does it interact with all the cases you all brought up?
Nobody wants that one? I don't know that I have too much to say on that, other than right now we're working with quite a few communities that lost systems and trying to utilize public assistance funding to not just fix things, but put things back better and do mitigation through that public assistance program, which is one of the great opportunities that we have, because some of these, they're $40 million projects. So when we look at 90 million, that sounds like a lot until you put in something like that, it eats it up very fast. So right now we have 3 communities that we're trying very hard to keep those within the public assistance program and fix the ones that broke. But it's a great question. I don't have a good answer really, other than it's something we need to be thinking about in terms of what types of floodproofing can we do in place for those systems, I think is the place that I would start, for the sake of how incredibly complex and expensive it is to relocate.
I'm not sure this will answer your question, but I think it's just kind of points to the fact that all of the planning issues we're trying to address are related, and they can all really work together and be opportunities to address multiple challenges that we're facing. So the vast majority of our wastewater treatment is septic systems, but what kind of we are looking to do is we need more housing and we need it to be denser, and that is also opportunities for building sewers that can treat higher density wastewater, address some of our water quality challenges, providing more housing. But also, as we do that, we need to make sure it's happening in the right locations, and locations that aren't going to be at risk in 5 years, let alone 50 years. So really trying to identify smart both land use planning practices as well as infrastructure practices. I think, it's really where we need to be focusing.
Yeah, one of the hidden elements of stormwater is that urban communities, because of all their impermeability, push a lot more water into rivers that they're nearby rather than being able to absorb it. So it almost exacerbates the flood downstream for all the rural and smaller places.
And the other thing that I will add, as the Regional Planning Commission in our Dayton, Ohio area, some of these conversations have been very, very siloed. And so we weren't planning together. And that's one thing that we are striving to do, is bring people together that may have not started to have those conversations to plan for the future together. So we're bringing together our water professionals, our economic developers, our land use and zoning and planning people, and having them all talk together and think about these things, about how do we protect our not only natural resources, but also our assets, our human assets as well, our people.
Other questions?
question regarding preserving housing with disasters, and we want to hear from the group about how you're able to preserve the number of units in your communities. And question, Cape Cod has a forward-looking flood plan, and I'm curious, Stephanie, if Vermont is also looking forward for the future. Thanks.
Thank you. So on the housing side, I think the biggest, it's the crux of the issue right now with most of the communities that we're talking about, because one of the biggest things we do is property buyouts. And elevations are a lot harder. FEMA makes it incredibly hard to elevate structures. Homeowners end up having to pay for part of it generally, and it's the complex nature of elevations makes it really tricky to prioritize a bunch of those projects when it's a lot easier to do buyouts, which is unfortunately part of the federal funding structure for those. So that's one piece of the challenge, but I think what we are looking for with communities that had a lot of housing impacted, like Barrie, had a ton of their housing flooded during this event, is identifying what are those areas where you can't go back. It should not be housing. We have to say this shouldn't be housing. How do we find the opportunities, like in Northfield, to be strategic about where we're doing those buyouts in a way that allows us to lower flood elevations and conserve housing that way? So we're looking for those opportunities. It's incredibly hard. And I think a lot of our communities are stuck in a place right now where they maybe don't want to move forward with buyouts at all because they don't have a plan. So there isn't a great way to crack that nut, but it's something we're thinking about constantly, is how do we bridge that conversation between doing these buyouts and people that are working in the housing space and trying to make those connections. In terms of long-term planning, so I have some notes for Chloe after this to learn a little bit more about that process, but yes, we're talking about a similar sort of model. So the FEMA Special Flood Hazard Area mapping is backlooking. It's just inundation. A lot of the maps are very old. I won't get into all of the challenges with it. There are many. So that's not a good tool for trying to figure out how we look forward and reduce our future risk. So we are looking at, through the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, through the state's Climate Action Plan, how do we improve those planning tools? So there is a lot going on in that space. That's still in process, but hoping very much to have a better, more interactive tool like what was shown in Cape Cod.
Trust it.
It may have died.
Oh, she may have died.
Yeah, there's no one.
Okay. Great. We're going to wrap it up.
It's subconsciously done.
It's subconsciously due this time. I want to thank you all so much. I didn't thank our sponsor, which is the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development, so thank you. And I really urge you to make it on time to the Emerging Leaders Awards, which is why we're going to let you go on time. When I read all their bios, I cried. So I challenge you to not cry. And I also just want to say there's a funders roundtable around resiliency planning. So some of the conversations or questions that you're still holding can be carried through to that session, which will be at the end of the day, a little bit more of a more informal time to interact with some of the experts that are here and kind of keep going. So the conversation doesn't end. But thank you so much, and thank you, Chris. And this is just genius. We could go on forever. But